My brother smirked while the judge read my grandmother's will. Not a nervous smile or an uncertain one, but the kind that said he already won. And I stood beside my lawyer Elaine Harper with my hands clasped tightly, forcing my breathing to stay steady as the courtroom settled into that heavy silence where every shuffle of paper felt louder than it should. Because this wasn't just about money, it was about the last thing my grandmother left behind and the way my brother had been circling it like a vulture for months, acting like grief was an inconvenience and inheritance was a prize. And when the judge finally adjusted his glasses and began reading the terms, my brother Ethan leaned back in his chair as if he were watching a show he'd already memorized, while my mother sat beside him with her lips pressed tight, eyes flicking toward me like I was the one causing trouble simply by existing in the room. And I realized then that they had rehearsed this. They had walked in expecting me to fold the way I always had at family dinners when Ethan talked over me, and my mother called it keeping peace. But this time peace felt like surrender, and surrender felt impossible, because my grandmother had loved me in a way my family never understood. She had seen me as more than an accessory to Ethan's ambitions, and 2 weeks earlier when she passed, the only thing she asked before she lost her voice was that I promise not to let anyone twist her wishes, and I had promised, not knowing how quickly my brother would move, how fast he would smile through condolences while quietly filing paperwork behind my back, because 3 days after the funeral he showed up at my apartment unannounced with a basket of muffins like a performance of brotherly care, his voice too warm when he said, "We should keep this simple, Olivia. Grandma would want us united." And I knew the moment he said united he meant obedient, he meant me signing whatever he placed in front of me, and when I asked what he needed me to sign, he laughed lightly and said it was just administration, and when I refused, his warmth vanished for half a second before he replaced it with that same smirk, telling me I was being dramatic, that I didn't understand how estates worked, that he was only trying to help Mom, that the family needed stability. And then my mother stepped in with her tired sigh and said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," as if my grandmother's legacy was a burden to manage rather than a boundary to respect. And I thought maybe they would back off, maybe grief would slow them down. But grief never slowed Ethan, it sharpened him, and within a week my bank app started sending strange notifications, inquiries I hadn't made, documents I hadn't requested, and Elaine, who had handled my grandmother's trust for years, called me with a voice so sharp it cut through my denial, telling me someone had attempted to change beneficiary designations on the restricted account, someone had submitted an authorization bearing my name but not my signature, and when she said the submitter was Ethan Carter, my brother, my stomach turned with a coldness I will never forget, because betrayal from strangers hurts. But betrayal from blood feels like your childhood collapsing in real time, and Elaine told me not to confront him yet, that desperation makes people careless, that the best revenge is patience with a paper trail, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to my mother's house and demand answers, but then I imagined Ethan smiling calmly, waiting for me to explode so he could call me unstable. So I stayed quiet, I watched, I collected, I listened, and now we were here in court, where he sat as if this was already his, and the judge's voice continued reading, "The majority of assets held in the Bennett Trust shall be distributed to Olivia Bennett." And Ethan's smirk twitched, just once, so small no one else noticed, because he expected his name first, and my mother's hand tightened around her purse, and then the judge added, "With the exception of any withdrawals or transfers attempted after the date of death, which shall be subject to compliance review," and Ethan's posture shifted, and Elaine's fingers brushed my wrist lightly, a silent signal that the trap was closing, because Ethan had moved too quickly. He had tried to steal before the ink of grief dried, and in doing so he triggered something he didn't understand, because my grandmother had built safeguards into her trust the way a wise woman locks her doors before the storm, and Ethan had forced the storm. And as the judge looked up toward him and asked calmly, "Mr. Carter, do you have any explanation for the unauthorized activity flagged on this estate account?" The smirk finally faltered, and in that tiny crack I saw it, the first hint of fear, the first realization that the courtroom wasn't his stage anymore, it was his mirror, and the truth was about to speak back. Ethan's mouth opened as if confidence could pour out on command, and for a second he tried to summon that familiar charm he always used at family gatherings, the laugh that made people think he was harmless, the easy tone that made my mother defend him before anyone even accused him. But the judge's eyes were steady and unmoved, and the courtroom air was too thick for performance, so Ethan cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, I have no idea what she's talking about," as if ignorance could erase digital trails, and my mother nodded quickly beside him like her belief could become evidence, whispering, "This is all a misunderstanding." But Elaine didn't even blink, she stood smoothly with a folder in her hand and spoke with the kind of calm that doesn't plead because it doesn't need to, saying, "Your Honor, the flagged activity was not a misunderstanding, it was an attempt to change beneficiary access and initiate a transfer from a restricted trust account within 48 hours of the decedent's passing," and Ethan's jaw tightened. his eyes flicking toward me with irritation that he couldn't disguise, because he hated being challenged in a room where he couldn't control the narrative, and he snapped, I was handling administrative duties, someone had to, and Elaine replied, administrative duties do not include forging a signature, and the word forging landed like a weight. My mother stiffened, her face draining slightly, and Ethan's voice rose, forging? That's a disgusting accusation, but Elaine turned a single page and held it up, the document with my name typed neatly at the bottom and a signature scrawled above it that looked like mine only if you'd never seen my handwriting, and she said, this authorization was submitted from Mr. Carter's IP address, notarized by a commission that has been inactive for 7 months, and the judge's expression changed from neutral to sharp, because judges don't like games, they like facts, and he asked Ethan directly, did you sign your sister's name? And Ethan laughed too loudly, of course not, but the laughter broke too quickly, and I saw the panic flicker behind his eyes, because he had built this plan on the assumption that no one would look closely, that family shame would keep me silent, that my mother's loyalty would cover the cracks, and my mother leaned toward him, whispering urgently, Ethan, as if she could pull him back from the edge, but he was already sliding, because Elaine wasn't finished. She said, Your Honor, the trust contains a compliance safeguard clause. Any unauthorized attempt triggers an automatic audit and preservation of all communications related to the request, and Ethan's brows knit, what communications? And Elaine's voice stayed level, the ones your office left, and for the first time Ethan looked truly confused, not angry, not smug, confused, because he thought this was paperwork, he didn't realize paperwork has echoes, and Elaine reached into her bag and produced a small sealed evidence envelope, not dramatic, just precise, and she said, in addition to the forged authorization, Mr. Carter contacted the Trust's servicing department by phone, and the call was recorded as required under compliance policy, and a murmur ran through the courtroom, because recorded calls turn private arrogance into public proof, and Ethan's head snapped up, that's irrelevant, but his voice cracked on the word, and the judge leaned forward slightly, Ms. Harper, he said, do you have that recording? And Elaine nodded once, yes, Your Honor, and my mother's face went pale, because my mother had always believed words disappeared once spoken inside family walls, but recordings don't disappear, they wait, and Ethan's mouth tightened hard, his hands curling on the table as if he could squeeze reality into compliance, and he hissed toward Elaine, you can't play that, and Elaine replied quietly, I don't need your permission, then turned to the court clerk, handing over a flash drive with a calm that felt like steel, and the judge nodded, play it, and suddenly Ethan's smirk was gone completely, replaced by a rigid stillness, because a man can argue with accusations, he can deny paperwork, he can call his sister emotional, but he cannot argue with his own voice, and as the speakers clicked on, the room held its breath, and I felt my pulse steady into something colder than fear, because this wasn't revenge fueled by rage, it was justice fueled by truth, and the recording began with static, then Ethan's voice, casual, confident, saying, yeah, hi, I'm calling about the Bennett Trust, my grandmother passed, I need to move things quickly before my sister gets involved, and the words hit like a slap, because there it was, the motive, naked and unfiltered, and the servicing agent's voice responded professionally, asking for authorization, and Ethan laughed, I'll send whatever you need, she won't even notice, she's always been clueless with this stuff, and my mother's breath caught beside him, her hand flying to her mouth, because even she couldn't pretend that was protection, it was contempt, and Ethan's voice continued, look, I'm the one who actually handles the family, okay. Olivia's abroad half the time, she doesn't deserve to walk away with everything, and my stomach twisted, not from surprise, but from the finality of hearing what he'd always implied, and then came the line that made the courtroom go utterly still, Ethan saying, just approve it. My mom's on board, we'll get the money into my company, then it's untouchable, and the agent replied, sir, that would be improper, and Ethan's voice hardened, improper is my sister taking what belongs to us, not her, not legal, like entitlement was a birthright, and the recording ended, silence slamming down so hard it felt physical, and Ethan stared straight ahead, face drained, because his own voice had become the witness that could not be cross-examined, and the judge's tone was colder than winter when he spoke, Mr. Carter, stand up, and Ethan rose mechanically, no smirk left to hide behind, and the judge said, this court is issuing an immediate restraining order on any estate-related accounts, and a fraud referral will be filed for investigation, and my mother whispered, broken, Ethan, why? And Ethan finally turned toward me, eyes wild, the first time he looked at me not as an obstacle but as a consequence, and he breathed, you recorded me? And I met his gaze calmly, no, I said softly, you recorded yourself, and in that moment I understood, the truth doesn't need volume, it needs a microphone, and Ethan had handed it one willingly, and as the judge dismissed the session with orders for further proceedings, My brother's shoulders sagged under the weight of something he'd never carried before, accountability, while my mother sat frozen, realizing that the family shield she relied on had cracked open in public. Ethan didn't look at me as the courtroom began to empty. He looked at the floor like he was trying to find the version of reality where his smirk still worked, but that version was gone now, replaced by whispers and paper orders and the sharp scrape of consequences, and my mother stood slowly with trembling hands, her face a mixture of shock and fury and something that looked too much like shame, because she had built her life on pretending Ethan's ambition was leadership, and now that ambition was being called what it was, theft, and as Elaine gathered her documents with practiced calm, Ethan suddenly stepped toward us, voice low and urgent, "Olivia, wait," and for a moment I heard the brother I grew up with, the one who used to sneak me snacks during long road trips, but then I heard the desperation underneath, the panic of a man realizing his plan had been dragged into fluorescent truth, and he added quickly, "We can fix this." Fix, the word people use when they mean erase, when they mean undo consequences before they become permanent, and my mother grabbed my arm hard, nails pressing into my skin. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this to us, not him, not you, the same collective she always used to make my boundaries feel selfish," and I pulled my arm back gently, not because I wanted to hurt her but because I was done being held in place by guilt, and Ethan's eyes flashed. "You want to ruin my life over a misunderstanding?" And Elaine's voice cut in calmly. "Forgery is not a misunderstanding," and Ethan turned toward her with sudden anger. "You're enjoying this," he spat, and Elaine didn't blink. "I'm doing my job," she replied, then looked at him with the kind of neutrality that terrifies manipulators, "a job you forced into existence," and Ethan's breathing became ragged as we walked out of the courtroom into the hallway where sunlight from high windows made everything look too clean for what had happened, and Ethan followed, lowering his voice, trying a different angle, the one he'd always used when charm failed. "Olivia, think about Mom," and my mother's lips trembled as if that was the only card left, but I kept walking because thinking about Mom had been my whole life, thinking about her comfort, her image, her peace. And where had that thinking left Mia? No, this story wasn't Mia's, it was mine, left me. Standing in the shadow of Ethan's entitlement, and Ethan stepped in front of me suddenly, blocking the hallway, his face tight. "You don't understand," he hissed, "if this goes federal, my company collapses," and the selfishness of it was almost laughable, because even now, even after the recording, even after the judge's order, he wasn't apologizing for trying to steal from me. He was panicking about losing what he built on the assumption he could take, and I looked at him steadily. "You should have thought about that before you signed my name," and something ugly flashed across his features. "Grandma would have wanted." And I interrupted quietly, "Don't," because my grandmother's memory was not his shield, not his excuse, not his convenient quote, and my mother's voice cracked, "Olivia, please, we were struggling, the word that turns theft into necessity," and I exhaled slowly. "Then you should have asked," I said. "You should have spoken to me like a daughter, like a sister, not like an account," and Ethan scoffed bitterly. "You would have said no," and I met his eyes. "Yes," I replied, "because it wasn't yours," and that was the moment his mask truly dropped, because he leaned closer and whispered with venom, "You always thought you were better than me," and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was the oldest truth in our family. Ethan didn't hate me for money. He hated me for being seen by Grandma, for being chosen, for existing outside his control. And Elaine stepped between us slightly. "Mr. Carter," she said, "any further contact will be documented," and Ethan's jaw clenched. "Document whatever you want," he snapped, then turned away sharply, and my mother stumbled after him, calling his name, but he didn't slow, because desperation makes people abandon even the allies they used. And as they disappeared down the hallway, Elaine touched my shoulder gently. "You did well," she murmured, and I felt a strange emptiness, not triumph, not joy, just a quiet clearing, like a room finally aired out after years of smoke, and 2 days later the restraining order became official. The estate accounts locked, Ethan's LLC flagged, and investigators requested records that would peel back every layer of his business, and my mother called repeatedly, each voicemail softer than the last, apologies tangled with fear. But apologies don't unforge signatures, and a week later we returned to court for the final hearing, where Ethan sat without a smirk, eyes hollow, suit wrinkled, and the judge read the findings in a voice that carried no emotion because law doesn't need emotion, it needs accuracy. The court finds evidence of fraudulent intent, forgery, and attempted concealment of estate assets, and Ethan's shoulders sagged, and then the judge's gavel struck once. All proceeds are hereby returned to the estate for proper distribution to Olivia Bennett as sole beneficiary. And this matter is referred to the district attorney for further action, and my mother sobbed quietly, not because she lost money, but because she lost the illusion that family could erase law, and Ethan turned toward me one last time, his eyes no longer smug, only small. "Are you happy?" he whispered, and I thought of my grandmother's hands, warm and steady, signing protections into her trust because she knew, and I realized happiness wasn't the word. I'm finished, I said softly, I'm free, and outside the courthouse the air felt brighter than it had in weeks, not because my brother was falling, but because the truth was standing where his smirk used to be, and I walked forward knowing that inheritance was never just money, it was the right to not be stolen from by the people who think your love is their leverage, and the court had played the recording, and with it, the last of Ethan's control shattered, not with shouting, but with his own voice finally held up to the light.